So what we do first, everyone, welcome. If you just joined us, we'll just say a word or two about the journal as such. Ghazi has very kindly offered to give us this sort of broad introduction. He joined JBE a number of years ago and was section editor for a number of years, but has recently joined Michelle Greenwood, based in Australia, as editor-in-chief of the journal. Congratulations again, Ghazi, to this important role that you've taken on. And so we'll do that for 5-10 minutes before I then introduce the new section. And then there should be hopefully plenty of time for questions and answers. If you have any questions, everyone, please put them in the chat. We've got quite a number of people here in the room, so probably best to use the chat, and then we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. So without further ado, I think I hand over to you, Ghazi, to say a few words. Is that all right?
Great. Yes. Thanks, Steffen. I want to start out actually just by thanking you for organizing this event. I think it's a great initiative and one of hopefully further kind of informative developmental kind of workshops we're hoping to have at the journal. And I don't want to take away too much time from this discussion specifically about the environment section. So I think there's a lot of maybe very important things to be said about this in particular, but I want to just say some few words about the journal, but I'll only take a few minutes to do that. So I'll give a bit of a truncated version of the kind of a usual presentation. I'll share my screen. Just can you confirm if that is working? Can you see?
Yeah, we can see that, Ghazi. You can make it maybe in presentation mode, that we can see the whole thing. Yeah, that works.
Is that
now.
good?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So yeah, so again, I'll just give a very brief version of this, maybe to only get the main lines around the journal that are relevant to the current section and the discussion. And there are a couple of details that authors who haven't been in contact with the journal might like to know about the particularities of JBE. So I should start out very broadly about the scope of the journal. So we publish original articles that cast a relatively wide net in terms of methodological and disciplinary perspectives. That part of our scope is highlighted, and I'll explain a bit about that. The journal focuses on ethical issues related to business and focus on bringing something new or unique to the discourse around business ethics. So that is theoretical, disciplinary, methodological. When this form of the scope of the journal really came into play in the previous term, which was the editorship of Michelle Greenwood and Ed Freeman, and they took two kind of broad lines with the journal that are continuing today that I should mention. The first is to really focus the journal around explicit discussions using a framing around business ethics. So many of you realize that there are many topics that have peripheral or family resemblances to issues around ethics, but often weren't explicitly discussed in terms of ethical concepts, ethics literature, ethics frames. Things like well-being, sustainability, CSR, many environmental issues have clear ethical implications and ethical relevance, but are not always described in terms of ethics and framed around ethics. The same goes for many sociological, also critical literatures and discussions. So part of what that reframing of the scope of the journal involved was really taking those subjects, making them explicitly framed in terms of ethics contributions and ethics discussions. So part of the scope is really to focus those discussions around business ethics and a contribution toward business ethics. So that's the first thing we look for when we receive submissions to the journal. But the second thing they did, which seems, if the first one was really a focusing move, the second was to broaden the field and to say that what we often think about as business ethics. It, in the past, had been a little bit more restricted, but we want to have a more interdisciplinary and a broad view of what ethics can be. So to at once focus the discussion and broaden it, and part of that broadening meant bringing in disciplinary perspectives outside of what was often thought about as simply ethics, which tended to be based in philosophy traditionally, and more recently in some of the behavioral sciences, often psychology, behavioral ethics, and maybe some CSR, sustainability kinds of topics. So really the idea was to cast a wide net in disciplinary terms to bring in new sorts of discussions. So I think our current discussion today around the environment is one of those attempts to bring in new disciplinary sources into the discussion of ethics, while making sure to frame it in ways that can be discussed ethically, so that at the same time broadening and focusing were kind of the dual movements which Ed and Michelle sort of brought to the journal, and which we're continuing now. So with that very kind of broad introduction, I came in, as Steffen said, as editor-in-chief just in January, so I'm learning the ropes very quickly, I should say, but I've been with the journal since 2016, when I was the editor of the psychology section. So currently we have over 60 editors that are distributed over 30 sections. So we have a very, very broad range of expertise in the journal, with a very large team, and over 3,000 submissions per year across a wide variety of areas. So it's a very, very big project. So we're in some ways really forced to think in very broad and interdisciplinary terms also for that reason. So let me give you an idea, if you want to see kind of the new directions we're taking the journal, which is in some ways a continuation of what Ed and Michelle had done, but in some ways also brings in some new elements. You might want to look at our recent editorial essay, which is the most recent statement of JBE from the editorial side. It just came out in February, where we talk about reconnecting to the social. So we really bring in the idea of social concerns as central to ethics, and not as a different field. For the purposes of this discussion, I think it might be worth thinking of the social not in a restricted way, but in a relatively broad sense of social, which clearly includes concerns with environmental, ecological, and perhaps non-human actors as well. So when we talk about the social, we can really think about the social in its broadest sense, in the sense perhaps in ways, for example, Latour might have talked about the social as forms of associating that can be made and remade, that are fluid. So ways of bringing in ethical discussions together with social discussions. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in that direction, to have a look at that essay, to get a bit of the flavor of the way we're thinking about the journal in its current form. So to give you an idea of some of the new sections we've brought to the journal, most of these were brought in under Ed and Michelle. In fact, all of them, but you can see a little bit of the breadth of topics we brought in. I should note the environment section, which is the number 6 on this list, but which is the newest section, and is the first section that has been brought in under when I was editor. The rest of them were brought in over the last 4 or 5 years, but you can see part of the breadth here. We have sociology, psychology, a critical scholarship, feminism, global issues, humanities. So this is working across the social sciences, the humanities, and maybe in some instances even the natural sciences. So we're considering under their ethical auspices a very broad range of different views. So these are all new, but I should say that this is also adding to a large suite of already existing sections. And perhaps most relevant to the discussions of the natural environment, we also have sections in CSR, and CSR in terms of theoretical and qualitative studies in CSR, as well as a section for quantitative CSR. And we also have a section on sustainability, right? So those were our existing sections, which had some connection to issues which could be relevant for the natural environment. However, in our discussions, we were noticing that a lot of issues that were important in terms of environment or ecology seem to be kind of slipping through those topics, that there are a lot of important issues around ethics and the environment that don't neatly fit into the topics of CSR or sustainability. And those were becoming more and more pressing and more central to current global concerns, so that we really needed a section that was able to deal with the environment head on, and not only through the lens of CSR and sustainability, although we also have that. So for people who are in areas around the environment that touch on issues of CSR and sustainability, also, you might want to look across those three sections to sort of see where your work might be positioned within those different discussions. Regarding the sections, let me just say a word about how that works in practical terms, because this is a point at which JBE is a little bit different than most journals. So when an author submits, usually in most journals in our field, the editors-in-chief will get the initial submissions, and then they will redirect submissions toward the different associate editors. But in JBE, for various reasons, which we might want to get into later, that doesn't happen. The author submits directly to the section at the moment of submission. So that means it will be the author who, at the moment, I'm showing the screen where you would find that. You can find the sections and the descriptions of each section, and Steffen has recently written one of those, and you submit directly to the section. Now, that doesn't mean that it necessarily stays in that section. If the editor finds that the article is outside of their scope, then they might still transfer to a different section, and that does happen with some frequency. It's worth noting that the submissions to the journal are not submitted ultimately to the section, they're submitted to the journal, which means that if a paper is rejected, it's rejected not from the section, but from the journal. So all editorial decisions are decisions about the appropriateness of the manuscript for JBE as a whole. What that means, in short, is that if the paper is rejected from one section, it can't be subsequently submitted to a different section. However, if something doesn't fit the scope of a particular section, the section editor can always transfer it. So that's the mechanism we have for making sure that the paper finds its right home in terms of what discussion it's engaging with. So I think with that, I just want to say one final thing. If you want to find out more information about all of the things, news related to the journal, we do have quite a social media presence on Twitter and Facebook. Traditionally, but we've also just set in last week our LinkedIn page. So I do encourage all of you who are here, if you have interest in issues of ethics, please do join our group on LinkedIn. We're very happy to have more people, and we're growing with that. So I'm here and available. Also, Steffen, if you want to check with me or ask me anything during the discussion, I'm happy to participate. But I'll give the floor over to you to talk a bit more specifically about the environment section. So thank you all very much.
Super, Ghazi. That's very useful overview, and thanks for doing this great and important job. It must be absolutely massive to dealing with what 3,000 plus submissions a year. Good luck with that, mate. I'm just sharing my screen. Can you see that all right? Great. Just needing to sort out my various screens here so I can see the chat as well as late coming participants who I need to admit. It's all going on here. Okay, we're good. Okay, so I'll talk for 15, 20 minutes or so about the new section, and then there should be time for questions and answers. As I said, please put your questions and comments, etc., in the chat. It's probably easier to do with such a large crowd in the Zoom call here. So I've been very, very happy to be invited to start this new section. As Ghazi said, this is something that's really just happened over the last 3 or 4 months since Ghazi joined as co-editor-in-chief. So very pleased to starting this new role. I'm very new to this job. I've only been dealing with 1 or 2 submissions so far, so this is very, very new, and so So this is my first presentation, and I've literally been thinking about over the last few days exactly how I'd like to develop this and position this. So, and of course, over the years, this will evolve, but there we go. These are my thoughts of where I'd like to take this. I should, before I go into the specifics, I'd like to sort of just say that the whole point of starting an environment section is to also make a statement that, in a wider business studies, business kind of education field, we haven't really done enough on the environment and the natural environment in particular. If you go through the main sort of prestigious, so-called prestigious publications that are highly ranked, that are often cited, etc., in the wider sphere of business education and business research, there are only a few journals here and there that really take the environment very seriously. If you go to the very big, highly cited, highly ranked journals, I've done a study like that with a colleague of mine who's actually in this call, Oscar Fitzroy, and we've kind of gone through the top business and management studies journals and looked for what they've published on climate change, and there's hardly anything out there, which is really surprising given that climate change is one of the, if not the most pressing challenges that humanity faces, and the same can be said about the environmental crisis we are facing. But business research is often not taking that seriously enough. The journals are not taking it seriously enough, and that's why I think it's very, very important to start this. And I'm very glad that JBE is taking this very much on board and is kind of enjoying a first mover kind of advantage here to kind of really tackle this head on. So that's the broader context here. So what I'll do now is I'll just go through a few themes that I see as being important. These are not supposed to be, not supposed to be a comprehensive overview of what I'd like to, publish in this section. It's not meant to be, a list of issues and research questions that that are possible. So these are just my ideas based, of course, on my interest and how I see the wider field developing. But generally speaking, if you have an idea, if you have a particular research approach, if you have a project that you think fits with this section, then basically drop me an email. Discuss an abstract or an extended outline of the paper, and I can advise, because environment and natural environment in general hasn't really been a dedicated research topic in the wider field of business research. There's not an established field necessarily we can draw on. And this first topic, you will see here already that the interdisciplinary aspects of this are very important to me. So, the first realization is that human activity, the way it exists on this planet right now, is influencing and has, particularly over the last 70 odd years, has influenced the natural environment at an unprecedented increasing scale, and it's impacting the ecosystems. So what is very important in this section from my point of view is that we develop systems perspectives of understanding the relationship between business and the natural environment. And here I'd like to just say a word about the word environment. I mean, of course, for those of you who do research on this, you will realize that environment can be used as a term in multiple ways. So the business environment in traditional mainstream business research is normally referred to as anything that's happening outside the boundaries of a business. So, for example, that includes, regulation, civil society, the wider context of the business environment that is very important to multinational companies, for example, in the way they plan their operations, their governance structures, etc., etc. Now, I'm less interested in that in this section. Of course, it does come in and it's important, but I'm particularly interested in the natural environment, ecosystems, and particularly the role of business and its relationship with the natural environment. So whatever I say here should be seen within the context of what Ghazi outlined as the general aims of the journal. So of course, we are particularly interested in the role of business. Of course, we are particularly interested in business ethics. So that goes without saying. But this section is particularly focused on the natural environment, and here systems perspectives in particular are very important. The next thing to realize is that, of course, we are in a particular historical era or time period. People have talked about the emergence of the so-called anthropocene. And this is basically to say that, something quite unique is happening. And this is not me saying, but, many scientists around the world are saying that over the last 200-300 years, humankind has had a particular impact on the natural environment. We are altering it, essentially. We are altering the Earth system. We are altering the biosphere, the atmosphere, and the hydrosphere. Some people attribute the C word to that, capitalism. Other people talk about industrialization. Other people talk about modernity. These are debates that can be had. So clearly something special and specific and unique is happening. And I think within the business ethics field and business research in general, we haven't developed enough a historical perspective of what exactly is happening and the role of business in making this happen, and the role of business in being responsible or playing a significant role in altering the Earth system. So I'm very interested in these historical perspectives and understanding exactly what is happening here. And there a whole range of interdisciplinary perspectives that are emerging. Earth system science, for example, Earth systems governance. These are sort of fields that are emerging that would be really useful to apply to fields of business ethics. Next one up is climate change, which is of course a particular challenge we are facing, a particular way of how we have breached the boundaries of the planet, the so-called planetary boundaries. Climate change is playing a pivotal role in how we are altering the Earth system. But here I should say, we're very, very quick to talk about climate change and climate change only. we mustn't forget that there's a wider environmental emergency going on. My university, amongst many other universities and organizations, institutions, parliaments around the world, have declared not only a climate change emergency, but environment and climate change emergency. There are many colleagues sitting here on this campus where I'm based, in Cornwall, southwest of England. You know, you've got a whole range of scientists here who are looking at the environmental emergency, you know, extinctions of species, you know, the crisis of the oceans, of marine life, you know, the cycles, the natural cycles, the nitrogen cycles, for example, not working on this planet. So the challenge is much bigger than climate change, but of course climate change is on everybody's mind and is particularly in this year re-emerging as we're sort of coming out of the pandemic in some parts of the world, at least. We are refocusing on the maybe even much bigger challenge of climate change that cannot be sorted with vaccination programs. So what interests me and many other people around climate change is, of course, that it's a global challenge, but it's a challenge that evokes differentiated and uneven dynamics. People are essentially impacted in different ways. The whole debate around justice issues is very, very important. I think that can't be highlighted enough, particularly within the context of business ethics, that whatever we do in terms of mitigation and adaptation of climate change will impact people in differentiated ways. And we need to discuss that in more detail. And I'd like to really see a whole flurry of research within business ethics on climate change, because there's so much research going on in publications in other disciplines, geography, for example. You know, why is there not much going on in business research and the top management and business journals? I don't quite understand. And of course, we need to look at the economic tools and the policy approaches that have been developed to dealing with climate change. Carbon markets, carbon trading, offsetting. I should have added, you know, the net zero as the kind of the latest language that's been used. You know, not a day goes by these days where you know, a big company doesn't declare a pledge to become net zero, whatever that means, by 2050, which is 30 years from now. So so there's a lot of activity there. ESG is another term I could have used, which in the finance world is emerging as an important term. ESG standing for environment, social, and governance aspects of business. There's also a need to look at technologies, the emerging low carbon technologies such as solar and wind, which are being implemented at ever larger scales, impacting people in a variety of ways, impacting economies, impacting organizations. But I also like to here just reiterate again the point that the focus on climate change itself and the sole focus on climate change can sometimes have unintended consequences. Some people might call it carbon fetishism, where, you know, if we just basically focus on counting carbon and forget everything else, then that has problems in itself. So we need to look at the wider social, economic, environmental trade-offs, and that I think is very, very important. I'd like us to challenge anthropocentrism. Most of what we publish in a journal of business ethics, in business research more widely, really assumes that humanity and human ethics is the most important thing. Maybe that needs to be challenged. I think it should. And there are a whole range of literatures out there that have done that for the last, well, at least 50 years. We've seen the emergence of animal ethics, plant ethics, posthumanism. There's a whole range of methodologies that have been developed to decenter the human. Actor network theory, which has been very, very popular in parts of the academy. And the whole point of actor network theory, just as an example, is of course to decenter the human and not look just at actors, but actins, as they call it. So a whole range of human and non-human actins that are acting often unconsciously, non-intentionally within the system. So I would really encourage us to develop methodologies and perspectives that challenge the human-centeredness of a lot of analysis that's going on in business ethics research. I'm also very keen to let the others speak, to see the others. Even just seeing the other, seeing other worlds, other ontologies and cosmologies is it's a vital step, I think, to recognize that we often see a kind of a hegemony, a kind of a dominant view of how we approach business and even business ethics. Other worlds are not often portrayed. Other worlds are not often seen. They're ignored or belittled. Bruno Latour and John Law and other A&T scholars have called this sometimes the one world world. There's a whole range of post-colonial and decolonial scholars that, of course, are talking about this and have talked about this problem of the academy ignoring or belittling other worlds. So I'm very keen to bring viewpoints in that are very different, to make other worlds visible, to work with indigenous people, portray their lives, land-based communities, and generally being aware that other ways of seeing and doing are existent and are very important to recognize. So there's this kind of recognition, this recognition work that I think we need to be doing, and I'm very keen to promote that in this section. And why is that important for a section on the environment and business ethics? Well, because a lot of these other worlds exist in land-based communities where people have often a very different relationship to nature and the natural world. Non-modern or a-modern perhaps relations, and I think I'd like to really see research emerging on that. On the other hand, the talk of the natural environment is really the talk of the day. So many people talk about the the rise of green capitalism or climate capitalism or green growth and, nature-based solutions to our environmental and climate change malaise are all around us. Not a day goes by really without a big conference or an event talking about these things. Governments around the world are very, very aware that climate change is a huge problem. Environmental crises are all around us, and that it challenges very much the fundamentals of our societies and our economies. So, so the green talk is nothing new and is ever increasing now. So what I'd like us to do in this section is to develop critical perspectives of these discourses and the practices that go along with these. What are the ethical and the governance implications of the emergence of a focus on natural capital, for example? What are the trade-offs? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? What is very important here is that we need to sort of see beyond the discourse of what people say. Companies and governments around the world are very quick these days to do the green talk, but we need to, of course, go beyond that and really study what is actually going on and what is actually being done beyond the talk. Coming to an end, so bear with me. And within that, the land is a particular focus, which is very important. As I said before, many nature-based solutions, many forms of green growth now involve the land, which again in business ethics research and business management studies more generally, again has really been woefully ignored or for a long time. So we need to see the land struggles, the land grabbing, the land use changes in the name of green growth, what many people don't realize, for example, is that installing large-scale solar and wind power technologies, at large scale is basically a land use change. It has huge implications for land-based communities. We don't hear enough about that. Okay, last slide, a word on methodologies. I very much encourage interdisciplinary approaches. I encourage qualitative or quantitative approaches or mixed methodologies. Theory is very important. We want to build theory, we want to apply theory, we want to take theory very seriously. I'm encouraging critical perspectives, going beyond the talk, understanding phenomena within the historical context. Normative ethics, so what's right and wrong? How can we develop a normative ethical framework for understanding these developments? As I said, history really matters. What is going on today is one thing, but how can we understand the historical emergence of what is going on today? It's another thing. Very keen on decolonial approaches. As I said, we need to see the other, we need to let the other speak, we need to go beyond Eurocentric and Western dominant hegemonic approaches, also in our methodologies. I'm very keen to see unusual spaces, places, and geographies. Do we need another analysis of the Fortune 500 companies around the world and what they do in terms of their ESG performance? Maybe we don't. Maybe we need to see beyond these kind of dominant frames of analysis and dig deeper. So I would encourage that. Okay, I've talked enough. Time for questions, comments, and I'm just now looking at the chat, and I'm sure I've missed quite a few of them. So okay, how does this new section differ from MDPI sustainability? Well, I think from my understanding of that journal, which is an open access journal run by a Swiss company called MDPI, well, I think they basically publish anything to do with sustainability. It's a very broad journal. This section is focused on the natural environment, and it's focused and is published in a journal called Journal of Business Ethics. So I think that is providing the answer. Could you provide some examples of what you would consider a sufficiently ethical perspective on environmental issues if we don't use philosophical theories? I'm still a bit confused about the narrowing but broadening idea of adding in interdisciplinarity, but still focusing on business ethics per se. Yeah, ooh, that's a biggie. I don't know, Ghazi, whether you have a response to that, because that's, I suppose, a general question. You know, we encourage ethical in the ethical focus, but at the same time, we want to encourage interdisciplinary perspectives. How would you normally address this kind of question?
Yeah, so that kind of question, it actually runs across our different sections, so it's not really unique to the environmental, but maybe to clarify, the use of the term ethical there is certainly not meant in any sense to say ethical as opposed to political, or as opposed to social, or as opposed to economic, right? It's meant in the most inclusive sense of ethical as something that's running through the political and the social and the economic. So it's not meant as a word that's meant to kind of restrain the discussion in a certain way. So I wouldn't worry about it saying, you know, for example, if you did something around political economy and we say, okay, well, that's not about ethics. I don't think that is the intention. Rather, is to say that often those discussions have implicitly an ethical component that is not brought to the forefront. So for those people who teach ethics, you often run into the problem that they say, well, all topics have an ethical component to them. So ethics shouldn't be a particular class or a particular topic because it's everywhere. And yet, when we do that, it often tends to get drowned out or sort of overlooked in the other discussions, and we have sort of strict disciplinary perspectives. So I think the focus on ethics is meant not to give it a specific disciplinary restriction, but to acknowledge and bring out what's ethical already in those topics. So when you were mentioning things about the Anthropocene or the natural environment, I think implicitly there are ethical topics which are being suggested ideas about what kind of a world is better, what kind of a life or what kind of society is better. Those could be normative questions, but they could also be descriptive. But the idea is to bring out the part of it that is pertinent to the ethical. So I know that's still quite abstract, and it's also something that we're working through in the discussion. So I think what I would suggest specifically to authors is to make the attempt to link it to the ethical, and then part of the discussion between the authors and the editor is to what extent is that contribution an ethical contribution, and what would it mean? So that's also something I think Steffen will be working through in his own formulation of that section as well. Does that help?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Ghazi. It certainly helps me also to understand my own job, what I need to look out for. But just to give you an example of the type of research questions, I guess I'd be looking for. So if we take climate change, for example, that we talked about briefly. So as I said, an analysis of the ESG performance of the Fortune 500 and doing a lot of quants around that is an important part of what needs to be done. And some journals publish that, but that wouldn't be enough for this section in this journal, right? We need to look at the wider ethical framework around what companies do and not do in terms of climate change. And the way I've explained this, of course, is to to link to questions around climate justice, for example, to to the trade-offs of climate change on one hand, and our sort of mitigation adaptation approaches to that, and trade-offs with with other social, environmental, and economic factors, right? So that's where the ethical comes in, I think, just to use one example there. Okay, David Evans, thanks very much for that positive feedback. Yes, theory, as I said in the last slide, very important to the journal and important to me as well. So I do hope we can have some good theory and conceptual papers too. Mario asks, does the section welcome micro-cognitive perspectives pertaining to whether alternative discourses paradigms, particularly among business managers, about the economy and economic growth and its relationship to the environment could be more widely embraced? My question relates to the presentation focus on the organizational business level of analysis. I think the general answer is yes, of course, that seems relevant. So the question is, where's the environment in there? So as long as it links to the natural environment in particular, I would welcome that. In terms of different levels of analysis, micro, meso, and macro are all absolutely fine. Ideally also analysis that go across these levels. So whether it's micro or very individual, cognitive based, that's all relevant, I think, as long as there's a link. An explicit link to the environment. Then we've got a question by Maoleng Bu. Many other JBE sections seem to have clear discipline affiliations, finance, sociology. Here, our new section looks very interdisciplinary. Yes, may lead to challenges for review process. Yes. So yes, that is a challenge. Yes, this section is very interdisciplinary. That's kind of part of the point, that we can't tackle challenges such as environmental crises, climate change, etc. We can't tackle these things by having a disciplinary perspective. We absolutely have to be interdisciplinary, which isn't to say that disciplines are not important anymore. So yes, that's a challenge. I've been doing interdisciplinary work really, ever since my PhD, I suppose 20 odd years ago when I finished my PhD. So it's kind of in my DNA, and I've got contacts to reviewers in many disciplines. So it's basically my challenge of finding the relevant reviewers. How I will practically deal with that will remain to be seen. But normally I will want to get 3 reviews for each paper, and I will basically invite reviewers from different disciplinary perspectives, and we'll get these different perspectives in, and then sort of my task is to sort of read across them and see how interdisciplinary perspectives can be built in that way. So different experts in different disciplines will be sent these papers. So that's all I would say to that, if that's okay.
Steffen, hi. Can I please ask one question?
Yeah, who's speaking, please?
It's Shujara.
Oh, hi, Shudara. Hi. Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay, so sometimes what happens, first, I would like to thank you and Ghazi both for a very informative introduction to the new section. It was really helpful. I would like to ask that sometimes, as we are talking about ethical issues, it's not necessary that the issues are going to be pleasant. Obviously, those are issues, so the realities might be bitter and bare. So, at what level, what type of openness you are intending to accept? Because at times I have seen that people wish to see even the bitter realities to be sugar coated.
Okay, well, yes, I have noticed that as well, and I think you know, many big journals are sort of probably not intentionally, but there's certainly a sanitization process going on here in terms of what issues are allowed to make it into journals. I can only say that you know, I'm trying not to sugarcoat anything. I'd like us to discuss challenging issues. I'd like us to discuss controversial issues. You know, within reason. And when I say reason, then I mean, you know, we need to be respectful. We need to you know, not use language that is off-putting people or discriminating against any people. We need to be inclusive and open in all directions, but certainly I'm very keen to not sugarcoat anything, and we need to bring some of these very challenging issues and controversial issues to the fore. But of course, our role is not to be, you know, sort of journalists who want to get quick headlines. You know, our role is to analyze, to take a step back and develop perspectives and develop perspective, which means, you know, we need to go beyond the sort of the immediate rush into judgment and critique. We need to develop you know, holistic, critical analysis, historical based analysis of what's going on out there. So I don't know whether that provides a good enough answer, but I certainly would encourage everyone to look to places that are often ignored, and that includes controversial issues that don't often make it into journals.
That is really kind of you. Actually, yeah, I completely agree. Respect in our writing style should be reflected in any case. But it is sometimes that we have to, for example, if we had some interviews and the interviewees managed to say something openly, which are basically highlighting the ethical issues, then it's sometimes we are often not encouraged to mention those things, and we are encouraged to sugarcoat it. That's why I preferred to ask you, what type of openness are you expecting from us? Is it we are allowed to share the realities that we have noticed during the research, or not?
Yeah. Yeah. So no, absolutely. So I very much hope that there's no kind of artificial sanitization process going on here. So Rajiv asked a question around, do you expect a prominent role of business in all manuscripts submitted to you? Well, I think, you know, the journal's called Journal of Business Ethics, so it's got to be about ethics and it's got to be about business. Whether that always has a central role for business is a question of judgment and a question of emphasis. I mean, I know you, Rajiv, and many others are doing great work on the role of communities within you know, within economic relations and business relations, for example, in mining areas, or, you know, other kind of extractive industries, for example. You know, clearly that is impacted, and we, you know, we talk about these issues because there's a role of business there. So I don't think it always has to have a central role. The analysis doesn't always need to be focused on the business. In fact, the whole point of what I presented today was to kind of go beyond that exclusive focus on the organizational boundaries of the business. The whole point of this section is to go beyond that. So I think the answer is no, it doesn't have to be a central role of business, but of course, the issues we are talking about here need to have a link to business and to ethics. Okay, Anna Kokkonen asked to clarify, studies on public organizations are also fine for your journal. Ghazi, I think I'm looking to you. I think the answer from my perspective, yes, of course, public organizations are of interest to us and the whole public governance. How would you approach that question?
Yeah, so from my view, this is clearly related to the last question about business and the focus on business. So I want to emphasize, don't get too caught up on again, a restrictive definition of business. It does have to be about business, and that is the scope of the journal. But there's a quote that I like to use personally to think about it, and it's a quote by Charles Dickens from A Christmas Carol. And the quote was from the ghost of Marley, who came back to talk to Scrooge, and he said, "Business, mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." So I think we need to take business in that sense, that what is our business here, as in what are we up to? What is our occupation, right? So I think we shouldn't let the term business be simply hijacked by a kind of for-profit corporation notion of business. It's a concept that can be used in a much broader sense. And so I think public organizations can be considered within the scope of business ethics. It just means that if you are using a notion of business that's broader than what I guess would colloquially be used, you might want to explain that more and explain your usage so that the editor would know what you're doing, right? So it means that there might be a little bit more elaboration necessary, but yes, I would see it within the scope.
Yeah. Thanks, Ghazi. And there's another question here around, again, about the role of ethics, and do we need to see ethical theories being used as the main theoretical lens? I think we've covered that really. I think I certainly wouldn't want to only see papers that are using explicit, narrow forms of ethical frameworks or ethical theories. Ethics really is a much broader concept and approach here, in the same way as business is something much broader than just the typical for-profit economic entity. So I think we need to sort of we need to see what I would encourage you to have a look at what the Journal of Business Ethics is publishing and has published, particularly over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Whenever you submit to a journal, I would encourage you to have a look what's been recently published there, to get a sense for how for how the editors basically, what papers they are promoting and what papers are making it through the review process, right? So I always have a, quite a detailed read of what is actually being published in a journal that is of interest to me. And, particularly focusing on the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, so that you get a sense of what is being published there and what makes it through the review process. So I would encourage you to do the same with the Journal of Business Ethics. And if you're not sure about whether your research idea, your publication idea links well enough to the world of business and to the world of ethics, then have a look at how other people are dealing with this particular problem by reading the papers. as I think Ghazi said very clearly, and how I outlined the section, I think we're approaching this in a pretty broad way. Having said that, you know, there's a kind of a, you know, there's a kind of a conundrum here between taking an interdisciplinary broad approach, but still we want to be specific, and we want to emphasize that there needs to be a clear link to the world of business and ethics. So maybe we can't have it both ways, but at least I think, Ghazi, that's what we're trying to do. Okay, Domenico asks, oh, just a positive comment, thanks Domenico. Yeah, lots of positive vibes here in the chat, which is great. So I think lots of people are welcoming this section, and which is really, really great, and gives me an energy boost to you know, to actually put the work in to make this happen. You know, it's a pleasure to be starting this with you, and I hope we're going to get many good submissions. Before we go, can I just say I'm planning, you know, maybe not in the next month or two, but maybe in September, October, I'm planning to hold a more explicit paper development workshop. Again, online. It will be sort of maybe a little mini conference. So where I invite prospective authors to send me paper outlines or short papers or even extended abstracts. And then basically we can have a, you know, set a day aside where we, you know, in a 3, 4, 5 hour session, we talk about these, and I'll give you feedback. And so it's sort of more of a workshop and more of a explicit paper idea, paper development workshop. So I'm trying to hold that later this year. If you're interested in that, please do send me an email. This is a general invitation. You know, if you don't want to wait for, you know, an official paper development workshop, then, you know, you can always send me a paper idea, you know, an abstract, or just a quick outline over email, and I'm very happy to give you some feedback of whether I think something fits into this section or the journal more generally, or not. So trying to make this quite interactive, and of course this is a kind of a new departure for the journal and business and management research more generally. So clearly we all, you know, we're all learning, we're all kind of trying to construct boundaries over this beast that we are bringing into being here. So it's not, you know, it's not a straightforward process, as it were, but yeah, hoping very much that you can be part of that. And I think we'll probably leave it there, unless there are any kind of last minute questions, any show of hands or anything that I've missed. No? Okay, great. Well, in that case, I'll thank you all for your participation. Thank you particularly to Ghazi for taking the time to be part of that. Your input's been very vital, actually, because, you know, we're all still learning of what it means to publish in Journal of Business Ethics. And so thank you very much, and have a good day, or evening, night, or whatever time zone you're currently in. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Steffen.
Thanks, Ghazi. Take care. Bye.